Got it. So what I'd like to do is to ask the three questions in turn and get a brief, and I please it would be brief from each of the councillors to give their views on the question, and then we'll perhaps open it up to the meeting for comments later. So the first question was, what in your opinion is preventing more people cycling in Reading? Can we start with, let's start with Rob. Rob?
Hello, yeah, so I was just unmuting myself and putting my camera on. Thank you, Joe, and yeah, good evening, everybody. My name is Rob White, and I'm one of the 5 Green Party councillors in Reading. I'm a keen cyclist myself. So the first question, what is the main reason why people don't cycle in Reading? Talking to residents, the thing that they most often give to me as the reason for not cycling is being scared of the very busy roads that sometimes are quite fast, that have a high volume of traffic on them, and they just don't feel like they are safe cycling in Reading, which is a real shame, because there are lots of routes that don't require you to go on a road. I live on the Kennet side, for example, and can get into town nice and easily on the Kennet side. It would obviously be good to address that. Do you want me to sort of talk any further? Is that the sort of length of answer you were after, Joe?
That's a good start. Paul, from your point of view, what do you think is the biggest thing stopping?
Yeah, hi there. Yeah, hopefully you can hear me. I've renamed myself as well. Yeah, so Paul Gittings, I'm obviously a Labour councillor for Minster Ward. I chair the Strategic Environment Planning and Transport Committee, which is the committee that obviously we make decisions that come through the committee on issues to do with transport is one of, and obviously the environment, as the name implies. Tony Page is the main portfolio holder, as you all probably know. I'm as well as being a councillor, so I work as part of the time as a bikeability instructor in Reading, and also do safer urban driving, which is training lorry drivers on road awareness, so regulated courses that Karen would know well about. And just to sort of further the thing, obviously I cycle killing myself for racing triathlons, so I've got sort of kind of all bases covered in terms of the sort of leisure commuting and transport angles. And say, just like Rob, we spoke before, you know, obviously keen cyclists and keen to see more people cycling. Yeah, just, I mean, more people do not cycle in Reading. I mean, I just slightly turn it around in terms of the participation levels. I mean, I think we're looking at about 2 to 3%. I'm not certain it was actually last properly measured. And obviously during the pandemic, we did see a big upswing in cycling. So I suspect the figures were much higher than that, you know, certainly during the first lockdown. And I hope some of that momentum can be maintained. So I don't think Reading is uniquely unique in having those type of figures, and I'll suggest actually that we're probably you know, actually nearer 3% is quite high. London, by contrast, is 25%, obviously, as we know, and I think Cambridge is about 10, was the next after London. So out of London, and I've been to a lot of towns doing the safer urban driving, we have those type of figures, and some a lot worse. I mean, I went to High Wycombe recently delivering a course. I delivered for 12 lorry drivers. It's pretty hilly there, actually. So, and I don't think I saw a single cyclist in the whole time I was there, actually, other than the guys I was with. And I think the reason for that, and Rob has touched upon it, was in Wycombe I could only find one piece of cycling infrastructure, just one. So I think, you know, cycling is perceived as an unsafe activity. It actually isn't. But better segregated cycling infrastructure is clearly a priority, and one of the reasons I think why there aren't more people actually on the road. I mean, I'll talk a bit later about some of the things we're doing, obviously, as regards segregated facilities and some you know that are going through at the moment. The other reason in Reading, I think, is, and it's the same again in a lot of towns, is that the transport infrastructure, I think, it's developed probably in the 60s and the 70s, particularly, is entirely based on the needs of motorists. And I use the IDR as a classic example of that. That was foisted on Reading by Tory Berkshire County Council before we became a unitary. And it's a major barrier cutting right across the town, I think, for cycling, and also the through traffic that comes off down through Caversham on the A4074, and also when the M4's closed. So there's a lot of reasons why Reading becomes quite congested, and I think people feel that they'd rather be in their car tackling that than on a bike because of traffic levels. And the final reason, I think, and I think actually this isn't kind of a positive thing that was happened over the last number of years, certainly since I've been a councillor. I mean, is Reading Buses, one of the few publicly owned bus companies in the country, I think probably the best in my view, has won lots of awards. And we've seen a big increase in journeys by this method. And obviously that's good news. It's keeping people out of their cars, and it's a modal shift in terms of sustainable transport. So, I guess some of the people that, probably travel on the buses might be using bikes, but that's the sort of context, I think, of that question. And obviously, as a council, we're trying to get more people on bikes, more people on buses, and less people in cars. So, move
on to Jane. And from your point of view, from what does the Conservative group think about this?
I think one of the issues in Reading is it is quite hilly. So I have asked people about this because I'm afraid, I didn't think you just wanted my opinion here. I've got relatives that live in Oxford and relatives that live in Cambridge, and there everybody cycles, but they're very flat. And one of the issues in and around Reading is we do have some very steep hills, and we just don't have the infrastructure. I live in Caversham Heights, and the road I normally drive up is St Anne's Road, and there is no space for a cycle lane there, and the pavement isn't wide enough to cycle on. And it's got cars parked both sides, so it's quite dangerous for cyclists as well.
So quite steep.
Yes, it's quite steep as well. Yes, that's why
I cycle a bit regularly, so
yeah. So it's not easy, and I think there is this perception of danger. I do know that I personally know several people who suffered massive one person who had a massive head injury, and one person sadly died when they were cycling, because car drivers weren't looking where they were going. So, and I'm afraid my mother was a physio, and she was absolutely adamant that my brother was not having a motorbike because she had treated so many people who'd come off their motorbikes, and also so many people who'd come off their pedal cycles as well. So I'm afraid that I am concerned about safety because we don't have the infrastructure. If we could separate out and have, I would love to see, we have that fantastic arterial route that goes through the whole of Reading called the Thames.
Question we're going to go on to. So can I go to Ricky and ask him his view of the Lib Dem to on this?
Yes, you won't be surprised to hear that the main reason for people not cycling in Reading, according to us, is indeed the perception of danger. Whether it's real or perceived, it really doesn't make any difference. It's the perception that counts. Nobody wants to cycle if it involves mixing with buses and HGVs on the same road space. And the current cycle lanes are mostly delineated with white dotted lines, which offer no protection from motor vehicles and are clearly not perceived as safe. The current cycle network, when you try to follow it, still leaves too many gaps where cycle lanes end and cyclists are unceremoniously dumped in with the other motor vehicles, large and small. Again, other things that worry people, cyclists don't want to cycle in and out of parked cars. And even where cycle lanes exist, they still often involve cycling past parked cars. And that's always a danger for cyclists. And I admit, by the way, I'm not a cyclist by any means, or any stretch of the imagination. I haven't cycled for donkey's years. But I accept that lots of people do, and lots of more people would like to, if they felt safe enough to do so. The other thing that people regularly point out to us is the state of the roads in Reading. And again, just yesterday, I was coming along the Meadway, where there is a bit of scabbed surface which to you and me looks like a large pothole, but to the council isn't deep enough to be a pothole. It's just a scab, or I don't know what they call it. But anyway, the cyclist that I was approaching from behind simply pulled out in front of me, no signal, no nothing, but just to avoid the pothole, and just assumed that cars would follow suit. And it's just an example of the way people put themselves in danger sometimes because of the road surface. And there's all sorts of bad examples of road surface in Reading, I'm sure.
Right. Okay. Well, so we've got a range of different opinions on why more people aren't cycling. So the next question is, in an ideal world, what would we like to do about it? Let's go back to Jane. In an ideal world, what would you do?
Well, I'd like to have more use made of the Thames side route, because we've got this wonderful arterial route that goes right through the town called the River Thames, and Rob's already mentioned Kennetside, is to actually use that to cycle places rather than trying to cycle along, trying to cross town by going through some of the roads. I think that would be much more sensible. And I don't know what people's opinion of this is, but in London, they tried to have shared spaces, particularly outside the big museums in South Kensington, and they found it was much safer for everybody and the traffic actually moved faster when they made it a wide pavement where you had a shared space between all road users. And I'd like to see us doing some of those things. I've lived in Germany, for instance, where people are allowed to cycle on the pavements. You are expected to ring your bell and make sure the pedestrians know you're there. But if everybody's considerate, I think that can work really well. Right. We've got parts of the town that are pedestrianised, and I want to be able to see cyclists to be able to access those areas.
Right, that's very interesting.
May I say something? May I say something following on from what Jane said? It's Nicola.
Oh, go on, Nicola, yeah.
Yes, we live just off Kendrick Road, and we walk into town a lot. And more people are cycling on the pavements in Kendrick Road, and yet we've got the 20-mile-per-hour limit and various other things to slow the traffic down. So there needs to be clearer indications that they're not meant to cycle there. But I think people get confused when they come along the London Road, which is shared, and then they start cycling up Kendrick Road thinking it's a continuation.
Right. Can we just thank you for that, Nicola, but can we go back to our councillors and we'll leave space at the end for comments from the floor. Paul, you've got some budget. If you had a much bigger budget, what would you be doing? Are you unmuted yourself? Hello,
right, here we go. Right, I'm there. Yeah, we have got some budget, and referring back to what Ricky was saying about road surfacing, we've actually allocated about 9 million to improve road services across Reading. But I agree that there's still some work to be done with that, because obviously better road services do obviously encourage people to ride bikes as well, because nobody wants to ride over a pothole. I think probably actually as a cyclist or a motorcyclist, potholes clearly can be a barrier as well. So I mentioned previously better infrastructure. So better segregated infrastructure will clearly hopefully get more people cycling and hopefully alleviate people's fears over safety. And as I mentioned, slightly touched on in the previous answer, we put in 5 active travel schemes to the government when we were bidding for the funding. The first one, the Shinfield Road, has been we've got the funding for that, and that actually went through my committee. That's an arterial route going past the university, and we've now, good news, got the funding for the second, which is the Bath Road route that was proposed, and I think was backed by the cycling campaign. So I think that will be that's one way. Obviously, we get more people cycling on our main routes into town. They don't remain perfect. There's a lot more can be done, but all that costs money, and the council simply doesn't have the money in the transport budget to cover those areas. We're talking a lot of money. It needs to be government funding, and hopefully we'll see that. So I also think we need to have better messaging about the health and social benefits of cycling, you know, as a means of transport, also as a leisure activity and sport. I think that's really important. And as I was saying before, there is a sort of myth about the dangers of cycling. Certainly, actually, the numbers of people appearing in casualties in A&E, the most for head injuries aren't from cycling; they are actually from being a passenger in a motor vehicle. But you know, leave that aside. I think we need to try and bust some of those myths, and that's you know, that's something a council can do. That's something the government do. And then allied to that, you know, we're seeing across London, and we hopefully do some of this in Reading. We're seeing lower traffic neighbourhoods, more 20-mile-an-hour speed limits. We mentioned Kendrick Road. I think, you know, hopefully that is a main route into town, coming down there from the university, and hopefully that will, you know, encourage more people to ride along with cars going slower. More school streets, we're putting in some of those. I think, you know, that will also, you know, get people, instead of taking their children to school by car, you know, all that can help. I may want to talk, I'm not going to do it now, but I think there's a lot to be said about demand management to cut unnecessary car journeys. I mean, 58% of car journeys are under 5 miles. I read today, and I think there's been a 20% increase in vehicle registration. So we have to do something about that, and I think that's something the government can do. But I'll mention that later. But certainly locally, some of those things I mentioned, more funding from the government, better infrastructure, lower traffic neighbourhoods. I think all that can help.
Right, fine. Rob, can we come to you? You obviously the Greens have got a good track record on this. What would your wish list contain?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Yeah, the Green Party are firm believers in cycling. Reading is such a small and compact town. It should just make sense for a very, very large number of journeys to be made by foot and bike. And unfortunately, we're not there at the moment. Just to give a couple of numbers, looking at the council's draft local transport plan, I think one of the measures that the council's using is 3 trips per week by bike, where it's the main journey, and they currently think Reading's at 5% for that. Places like, I think, Cambridge, it's a gold standard, that's up at 40%. In places in Europe, it's at that level for the country. So there is definitely a long way to go for us in Reading, unfortunately. In terms of some quick wins, cyclists could be allowed to use the station underpass as the cycle campaign campaigned for. Cyclists could be allowed to use the whole of Broad Street as the cycle campaign campaigned for, which the Green Party supported. Other things, rather than doing little bits of piecemeal 20 miles per hour, as has been the Labour Council's policy, we think we need a town-wide 20 miles per hour. That would mean drivers knew where they stood. It's not one bit of 20 and then one bit of 30 and then one bit of 40 and back to a 20. It would give some sort of consistency. We think there need to be more segregated cycle lanes, so people feel nice and safe and secure in the cycle lane. It's not just a narrow cycle lane with a strip of paint separating them from the traffic. We think there needs to be some behaviour change, maybe some one-to-one travel audits, as has been done before, where someone sits down with a member of the public, talks to them about how they get around at the moment, and offers alternative ways that they could be completing their journeys. It's great that Paul does the cycle training. Really do admire him for the hard work he puts in on that with others, and I think more of that would be a good thing, getting more of our kids cycling at a young age and starting early. I think there needs to be more consultation from the council with cyclists. You don't have to look far back in time to the Caversham cycle scheme that was put in. I think it cost about £45,000 and then was taken out a week later. We've had Sidmouth Street go in, and I've been down it once. I live in East Reading, so Sidmouth Street is somewhere that's fairly close. I think I've been down it once since it went in, and that was just to see what it was like. And it was lovely to cycle down it and have all that space, but it's just not a route that cyclists use. And more consultation, more talking to the cycle campaign and cyclists would help to get the best sort of schemes possible. And just to finish, Joe, funding's being talked about. One thing we did with the council and funding a little while ago was we tried to get the council to commit a percentage of its transport budget, of its revenue transport budget that it has control over, to spend on cycling like they did in Edinburgh, and to have an escalator. So I think in Edinburgh they started at 5% of the transport budget, and then they had a 1% escalator every year to increase the amount of money that has been spent on cycling, and that would improve facilities locally, and it would mean that we'd have more officer time to be putting in for money from central government. That would be a sort of a win-win for cycling and transport in Reading.
Excellent. Now, Ricky, again, bit blue sky. What would you like to see?
Well, there are two things. First of all, proper segregated cycle lanes, which is a given, I think, for most people. That's the ideal, is to segregate cycles from other road users, and particularly from HGVs and buses and bigger vehicles. But the other thing, and I'm glad to see that Rob and the Greens are also now supporting town-wide 20-mile-an-hour limits on all residential roads over the whole town, and not just a hodgepodge of 20 and 30 miles an hour, or even 40 miles an hour, but with no enforcement. And that's the key, or one of the keys, is that it's all very well having a 20-mile-an-hour limit, but if you let motorists rule themselves, they will never obey the 20-mile-an-hour limits, or at least a good number of them won't. As in already a good number don't obey the 30-mile-an-hour limit. So I think 20-mile-an-hour limits actually will not only bring speed of traffic down, but it will encourage people to use alternative forms of transport. It's safer for people out walking, it's safer for people on cycles, it's safer for people on mobility scooters and the like. So I'm a big believer in 20-mile-an-hour limits, and the sooner we get it on all residential roads in Reading, the better. There are other more radical things we could be doing. Things like doing away with on-street parking bays and use the road space for segregated cycle lanes. It's a bit of an environmental win-win step for lowering carbon footprints. However, from a political point of view, it's probably madness, and I think you'd probably upset more people than it would help. And you certainly need very strong local backing before you went down that road. One other thing that springs to mind is security. If you're going to cycle into town, you want to be able to park in a secure place, know that your bike is being looked after, and when you come back at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, it's still there. There is an issue there with cycles and thieving, and I'm not sure we've got on top of it in Reading at all. And the more people we encourage to cycle, the more thieves are out looking for people or bikes to nick. So a word of warning that we probably need more CCT coverage of cycle parking areas. One last thing is actually, you talked about hills in Reading. I live in Tidehurst, and we're up and down hills all the time in Tidehurst. But these days, people are now using electric cycles. So they have an auxiliary motor to get up and down hills like that. So Jane, I'm sure are working in Caversham too. And it's quite interesting that these electric cycles are flying off the shelves. So I assume people are actually moving over to electric cycles. I've not had any official numbers come back on users.
Right.
Can I just come back on that? Yes, we do have some people using electric bikes. Sadly, one of my next door neighbours had theirs stolen. So if if you're going to invest in one to get up and down, get up the hills, it's a good idea. But make sure you install an app on it so you can see where it's been nicked to and get it back. But you can stick like Find My iPhone. There's one of those that you can put on it as well. It's incredibly frustrating when they get stolen. It's great to see them over here. My nephew's ridden one for a couple of years over in France. A lot of his friends have as well, and they found them really helpful.
Right. The final question then is, we've got these good ideas. What's stopping us? Let's go. I'll come back to Paul at the end of this because he's got he's got first strings. Jane, you're on the screen. What do you think is stopping us going ahead with these schemes?
I think one of the issues though is road surface. We do have a lot of potholes or scalpings, and if you hit a deep pothole in the car, it your tyres any good. But if you hit a deep pothole that you haven't seen on a bike, it can knock you off, and you don't want to do that, because you certainly don't want to do that, be run over by something else, another vehicle coming the other way. So I think we really do need to try and sort out the potholes. We had the council survey last year when they talked to 1,000 randomly selected residents, and their main concern was about the state of potholes, roads and the pavements. And that's why the council has borrowed £9 million for that programme to update those, try and fix as many potholes as possible and make the road surface better. I'm really pleased about it because as a councillor, potholes are the main thing that people complain to me about. It's a big issue.
As a regular cyclist, I would say here to that.
I think that's the one thing we really, really need to do. And the other thing, maybe, we just need to teach people to share. So, if you're driving and there's a cyclist, slow down and give them some space. Be courteous.
Potholes and driver courtesy. I'll buy both of those. Rob, what's stopping us going ahead with this?
Thanks, Joe. I think the main barrier to making substantial progress on cycling in Reading is a lack of ambition from both the government and, unfortunately, from the council. The amount the government invests, these are 2020 figures, but the amount the government invests in cycling is paltry. I think they're at £7 per head. I think Manchester's aiming for 15 with an aim of getting to 50. The figures are out of date, but it's just been chronically under prioritised and chronically underinvested for years, and so we're just miles behind where we need to be. Looking at the council's draft local transport plan, if you cast your mind back to the figures I gave earlier, currently cycling 3 times per week for your main journey, it's 5% of journeys, and the Cambridge up at 40% now, much of Europe at that level. The council's draft transport plan proposes increasing that 5% up to a not much higher 10% in the next 16 years. And so that's a lot of years and a fairly small increase. I think in Reading we have to be far more ambitious for cycling and give it a far greater priority. And from that will flow resources. From that will flow greater numbers of people cycling, and rather than sort of walking through treacle, it will be a far more positive direction of travel. And so Greens are ambitious for cycling and would give it a far greater priority.
Excellent. Right, Paul, you've got the purse strings, so when's it going to happen?
Well, as I was trying to say, we haven't really got the purse strings. I mean, I would say since 2010, Reading we've lost £50 million of revenue spending out of our budget, from the start of austerity till now. So this is obviously been a major problem, and it cuts right across all areas, including obviously the transport budget, and funding is a very, very major issue. So in terms of major schemes, we are almost entirely reliant on government funding through the Department of Transport. And look, during the lockdown, they did come up with some emergency funding. Some of the schemes that Rob refers to in terms of Sidmouth Street and Caversham, those were schemes that there wasn't a time allowed for consultation. Actually, where the funding was allocated, there are emergency schemes obviously to meet the demands during the pandemic. So I think obviously we're reviewing some of those, Sidmouth Street and obviously the Caversham we mentioned. But the more permanent schemes now, the active travel schemes, as I say, we come forward with 5 very coherent schemes across the major and arterial route. There's no lack of ambition for the council, and if we were supplied with the funding and the means, we would want to do a lot more. And in the last budget, we had over £30 million of climate measures, including obviously that has an impact on cycling. And Rob made some political points. I mean, the Greens actually voted against that. And as regards the local transport plan, I mean, you set a target as against what you can realistically expect within a certain time frame, and obviously the government will try and help us reach that target with some of their funding. But the target's not capped at 10%. I mean, I was actually quite pleased when Rob said that we'd reach 5. Obviously, he's got access to the figures more than me. 10% would be a good figure. But yeah, look, we want to make it 2030. But as I say, it is reliant on funding, and I think it's reliant on a lot of things that are controlled by national government. And I mentioned demand management. And things like road pricing, making people think about those short journeys, those 58% of journeys made under 5 miles. That doesn't just affect that doesn't just affect Reading, that affects the whole country. We can't look at Reading as a sort of little borough on either side of Woking, and we need to look at these on a sort of a slightly bigger, on a wider footing, and obviously to tackle the climate emergency. So I think there's got to be a lot of thinking nationally about this, and for Jane, she's represents the Conservative Party, to badger Alok Sharma, he's the climate change guru now, about this, to put the proper funding in place so councils can put in place all the schemes. We're broadly in agreement as councillors here. Actually, you might sort of have a sort of few disagreements about whether we should do this or that, but basically we're in agreement here. We want better segregated routes, better public transport, and less people driving their cars. But we do need the funding to do that. It's just not sort of, as I say, in Reading, we committed 30 million out on a very tight budget to do this. We're bidding through the active travel schemes. We've just won 250,000 from the Capability Fund, which will set up a cycle hub. So referring to Ricky's point and others about cycle security, we hope to have a secure cycle hub in town. We're going to discuss that on the CAST forum, which I'm chairing tomorrow, and also the cycle forum, where we can go with that and what we would like to see with that. So I think that's another opportunity. There's a lot that can be done, and a lot there is planned on the local transport plan, which I think sound quite ambitious. We're talking about workplace parking levies. We're talking about possible congestion charges we're talking about stopping emission zones, stopping vehicles driving through Reading, polluting vehicles. All those things are in the local transport plan, and that will be developed over the next number of years. But there is no lack of ambition, and hopefully we can look back in about 10 years' time and see that we've had some successes in that, and we've got a lot more people cycling and also using public transport.
Thank you, Paul. I'd like to open it to
just a minute. Do I ever get a chance?
Oh, sorry, Ricky, I've missed you out. Sorry. Sorry, go on, Ricky.
Right, we talk about what's the biggest obstacle to achieving an increase in cycle use. Well, clearly, one of the main obstacles is funding, and that's not just the government. It is certainly the council and the council's lack of ambition. And I'm sorry, Paul, but no, you're way behind on low emission zone. Other people actually put them in place. We're still talking about them, possible, and I have no idea when we might even see one in Reading. The 20-mile-an-hour limits on all residential roads is not. I don't know. It's nowhere in your sights at all. And I think that is an admission that your policy, despite the present local transport plan, needs, I think, reinforcing considerably. We need money, certainly, to segregate cycle routes. That is one of the biggest issues that we've got. But this issue of 20-mile-an-hour limits on residential roads actually has benefits not just for cyclists, but for all road users. And I think the fact that we are still got our heads, ostriches with heads in the sand, and we're trying to put in little schemes together over Reading, so we have a hodgepodge of 20 and 30-mile-an-hour limits and no enforcement on any of them. I think that is a big issue, and we need to take that one much further and quicker. We need 20-mile-an-hour limits on all residential roads, and we need some enforcement as well. I think I will leave that there.
Right.
Yes.
Thank you very much for those comments. I'd like to put it. Do we have our hands up system? We're going to have some system running.
No, it isn't. It's my picture of university.
Right. Do we have any questions to our distinguished councillors, from the meeting? Keith, do you want to have you've got your hand up?
I'm good. Okay, please.
Yes, I do have my hand up. You can put that icon there if you want to order the meeting. We've got 26 people in the meeting, so it might be a good idea if we do that. I'd like to ask a question, which is in two parts, and thank you to all the councillors for your contribution tonight. And I'd like to ask a sort of specific question about the local transport plan to Paul, and then a more general question to the other three councillors. And my specific.
Can you, whoever it is, can you just mute yourself? There's a background noise coming through over disturbing Keith. Can you all mute yourself if you think you're if there's background noise?
Thanks, Joe.
Okay.
Yeah, I think Rob referred to that as the local transport plan. So my question to Paul would be, sorry, the draft local transport plan. So if that's the case, I think the statutory consultation closed about a year ago. Why is it still a draft and has not been adopted if that indeed is the case? And for the other three councillors, after Paul has answered that question, I'd like to get your thoughts on the draft or not draft local transport plan as it stands, because my memory of the consultation was that it had some good stuff in it and it was quite a departure from previous local transport plans. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, thanks for acknowledging that, that Keith. And I think we actually this did. I think when it came to policy committee a while back, we've been in this sort of virtual world for a lot of the time, and now obviously the councillors we are meeting in public. The simple reason why it still remains in draft is actually largely pandemic related, because a lot of the measures that are in place there, are based on potential traffic flows, whether people will return to commuting, all those type of issues, and it makes forecasting what's going to happen in the future, in the near future, really quite difficult. And Ricky mentioned obviously low emission zones. We've obviously been looking at that and whether they are, the way they're being proposed, will be feasible for Reading in terms of making it pay, because in the end they do have to wash their face, these schemes, and at the moment the jury's out on that. So we don't know what I think it's what's going to happen even in the next 6 months as regards at the moment. If you drive around Reading, I think you'll probably find that at peak hours it's rather like the sort of extended school holidays. I don't know if other people have found this. So, for instance, the schemes that we talked about, the Bath Road one, which is the second one going in, that could be quite a controversial scheme if traffic returns to normal levels, because you're effectively taking away a lane of traffic, particularly the bottom there when it gets down to the Councillor Hill roundabout. We're going to go ahead with it, but as I say, it's difficult to quite foresee what's going to happen. So that really is a simple reason for it. But we expect that to be finalised in the next, probably into the next year. But you're right, Keith, it is ambitious, And I don't think, you know, the fact that it's been slightly delayed takes away from that. But there are a number of, for instance, you know, the parking levy. We don't know how many people actually now are going to return to their offices full-time, 5 days a week in all these office blocks in Reading. It might be the flexible working, but that isn't the case. So that's one, you know, that's just one particular area I choose. So, you know, I'm hopeful that one of the, I hate to use benefits of the pandemic. There's no benefits when so many people sadly lost their lives. But one of the things that will come from it will be people's work habits will change. There'll be less commuting at peak hours. People will space out their journeys, and they'll use their cars less and cycle more, and return to public transport, obviously, when people feel safer about it. Because at the moment, a lot of people are using their cars because they don't want to go on the bus because of fears over COVID. So that's essentially the answer that I would give to that, Keith.
Right, Ricky, you know, you any further comments? Ricky?
Yeah, here we go. I'm not quite sure what you're after.
Keith's question was to the others.
I think it was a fairly open question as to the other councillors' view on the draft transport strategy to 2036. That was in consultation in last year.
Yeah, you heard me in the previous answer. I don't think it's ambitious enough, and I don't think it tackles what I regard as one of the key issues, which is 20-mile-an-hour limits on all residential roads in the whole town. It certainly talks lots about workplace levies. It talks about low emission zone, but doesn't actually lay any plans for any of them. Other towns and other cities are way ahead of us, and don't even look in Europe because they're miles ahead of us. And I think we are missing a bit of a trick because we are simply not being ambitious enough in some of the things. So yes, in terms of the local transport plan, yes, it's good as far as it goes, but it is not the be all and the end all. We certainly could do an awful lot better.
Jane, you say you've got, you know, experience of Germany and France. So how does your experience, you know?
I certainly don't have experience of either Germany or France.
But Jane was saying she did, yes.
Well, there, you know, more people cycle, and you have, you know, wider pavements, and you're expected to be able to share the space, so cyclists can cycle and pedestrians can walk. And you know, I do think that there are some stretches of pavement where I think it would be good to have the cyclists there. You know, I get very frustrated. I go over Caversham Bridge quite a lot, which obviously was built 100 years ago. And one side, we've got a cycle lane on it. Frequently, the cyclists don't use it. They're on the road. They're not in the cycle lane. And then if you're coming north from the town side into Caversham, there's no cycle lane. And it's just like, well, why have you got a cycle lane one side and not the other? And they're saying, well, because the road gets too narrow and then you'd have cyclists running over people by the dentist. Well, why can't they, you know? Anyway, so that I think is, you know, is really frustrating. You know, in the local transport plan, the one thing I am pleased about is that we've got another bridge in there, a third Thames bridge. The idea being that it would connect up to a new road. Now, I know Ricky's going to be shaking his head, but if we can get the lorries through the other side of Reading and out, rather than putting them right through the middle in the IDR, I think that should help. It should also improve air quality because, you know,
yes, I don't think a northern orbital route we could take in HGVs would be a very good idea for the people of Caversham, though. Yeah,
it would be, wouldn't it? If we could get them through a new road that would go the other side of Caversham Park Village, that would be great. Because, you know, we should have, you know, years ago they should have stopped lorries coming down the A4074. They should be going down the A34 instead, but it's not happening. And we get these massive great lorries that come down and, you know, try to turn over the bridge, you know, near where we used to have the old Barclays Bank. And, you know, they nearly take the traffic lights out. And that, you know, heavy lorries, that when they brake on the bridges, they shake those bridges to bits. And that's why we constantly have to be paying for bridge repairs. You know, those bridges were never designed to take such heavy lorries. So we really need to get the HGVs out of central Caversham and out of Reading, because, you know, they're only driving through to go down to the M4. They're not, you know, all the A33, they're not, you know, as Tony Page always says, they don't stop and have a cup of tea even or buy anything in Reading. It's just traffic.
Rob, local transport plan, what are your, your final thoughts on this?
Thanks, Joe. I guess it's hard to have any particularly concrete final thoughts on the local transport plan, because things are just so up in the air at the moment, and it's just not clear to me what is going to be in a local transport plan that is agreed. I think probably the council needs to go back to the drawing board and do some more consultation, rather than having done some a year ago when things were totally different. I think, as I said before, as far as I can see, cycling hasn't been prioritised. The council hasn't been ambitious. If you look at the target for cycling in there, as I said, it just doesn't reflect any sort of high level of ambition from the council, from the Labour group for cycling in Reading. So I just think, I would go back to the drawing board. That is what I would like to see. It's always handy to follow the money, I think. The Green councillors some time ago suggested the council use a workplace parking levy as a way to raise money for other more sustainable forms of transport, healthier forms of transport. At the time, the Labour group shot the idea down in a load of flames and smoke. It's good to see that they've come around to the idea a bit more positively. And so it was in the draft and the consultation, but they've sort of stepped away from that a bit. We've got the East Reading Mass Rapid Transit scheme is back in the local transport plan as a possibility. That scheme sucked up a load of money. I can't remember how much it was in the end now. It was getting on for £1 million, I think, that could have been, that was just went up in a puff of smoke as Wokingham Council rejected it at planning, not once but twice. That money could have been used for a whole host of other things, including cycling. If Reading had gone for a low emission zone years ago and bid for that sort of scheme, rather than going for the white elephant of a East Reading Mass Rapid Transit scheme, a destructive road by the Thames, then it could have had it. It could have implemented it. It could be moving on to an ultra low emission zone, managing the number of cars down and creating space to be reallocated to walking and cycling. But they just haven't done that. Follow the money again. When we suggested that a percentage of the transport budget be allocated to cycling, they weren't keen to do that because they know that it's a derisory amount compared to what's needed. So back to the drawing board for the local transport plan. I think there were some reasonable things in there, but there's a whole load that isn't.
Right, we've used up 3/4 of an hour. And we've certainly had a very open and honest debate. Can I, are there any more, different questions from the floor of the meeting, that any burning questions that people would like to ask our councillors while we've got them here? Any little hands going up?
Sure, I saw that Eric Needs has his hand up.
Eric.
Hello. Jane mentioned experience in Germany. I'm aware that in Germany they have a hierarchy of road users based on vulnerability. So at the top of the pyramid is the pedestrian, then comes the cyclist, and finally the car driver. Here it's very much the other way around, so the car is at the top. And I get that, they're the majority and they're a very powerful lobby. However, I understand that there's a proposal to change the highway code so that the German model is adopted here. The trouble with that is this change may not happen, but even if it did, it would take a generation before it came through as drivers aware that they have to give priority to pedestrians and cyclists. It also affects the way that cycle routes are designed. So You have a cycle route, which is fine, but every time you come to a junction, you have to give way to the cars which might be turning left or right in front of you. So it makes journeys on cycle paths rather slow. And the other problem with those is that once you get to a difficult situation where the road gets narrower, you suddenly find that the cycle path disappears. So really, they're just not very well designed. They're pieced together to try and keep, I think, to keep the cyclists off the road so that they don't interfere with cars, rather than the other way around. So we need to give cyclists and pedestrians more protection, and to adopt this German model with the hierarchy the other way up. Thank you.
As in a nautical fashion, power gives way to sail in rural.
Yes, exactly.
Can I add something to, and ask Paul to come back in this? One of the things that troubles me, and I know troubles other people, is that schemes are put in on, and we don't understand on what factual basis, and what evidence that is used for designing the schemes. But much more importantly, there doesn't ever seem to be any follow-up to see whether the scheme is actually working. And as my fellow committee members know, I live on Redlands Road, and I'd love to know, what evidence there was that that scheme was going to benefit anybody, let alone cyclists, and what's being done to make sure that it is actually working. Paul.
Yeah, I mean, just referring actually to Eric's comments, I mean, I think that was welcome news, the proposed new hierarchy in the highway code, which I think would go pedestrians, horses, cyclists, which are obviously the three road users that have had a historic right to use the road for free. Everybody else has to pay based on their emissions, and quite rightly so. So there's no such thing as road tax, as you see when you look at columns in the local newspapers with just proposing schemes and think we should all pay road tax and have lights and insurance and goodness knows else. But I completely agree that would be a game changer, and I think that's something the cycle campaigners right across the country have been arguing for. And I think that when you ride on, I mean, Jay mentioned these shared paths. I mean, as a sort of cyclist, I think when I'm going with children with bikeability, I make really good use of shared paths, but I always have to remind them when you get to the junctions on the Bath Road that you're giving away to, there's a little strip you're giving away to cars, and that actually can be quite, it's actually can be A, tiresome because you have to keep waiting at every junction, and B, quite dangerous. So I think that would make a massive difference actually if the government do follow through on this, or these proposals are supported. And I think actually that I saw that the RAC, I remember, were in favour of them, which is a motoring lobby. So I think that would play a significant role. As regards to, I think you mentioned about the schemes. I mean, they are evaluated at the moment. We're evaluating some of the tranche one schemes, including Sidmouth Street and others, in terms of their effectiveness. Don't quite ask me how, but I think there's measurements are made, and at times transport officers go out there and have a look at those schemes. But usually they're based on local need, by local councillors, local residents raising issues of speeding in certain areas. So in my ward, we put in lots of 20-mile-an-hour schemes right across the ward, including roads like Southcote Road. And so the council is putting in these 20-mile schemes. Admittedly, not every road is 20 mile an hour. And there are arguments both ways for that. They've done that in Portsmouth, and I don't think they've shown any significant increase, A, in cycling, or B, in road casualties, because as Councillor Devine pointed out, it's not, the police don't enforce these speed limits, so it becomes more a behavioural change rather than actually something through legislation. But certainly the priority thing would make, I think, a massive difference, and start to send the message out that the government, is prioritising other road users, other motorists. Motorists take up 77% of all journeys. They're an incredibly powerful lobby, and one of the main barriers to action is the power of that lobby, and the impact they have actually on politicians at all all levels, particularly I think that at national level as well. Anyhow, so that, you know, I'm so happy to answer any more questions on things.
Okay, one last round of comments from you all. We're doing this under the auspices of the Reading Cycle Council.
Nicola and Clive want to have a question.
Oh, right, go on, look quickly then, Nicola.
Okay, we've cycled quite a lot in France over a period of 10 years, and the cars always gave cyclists a wide berth. And we found out the reason why they were so respectful towards cyclists is that the law states if there's an accident between a car and a cyclist, it's up to the car driver to prove that it was the cyclist's fault. It is automatically the car driver's fault. And I've heard it's a similar thing in Germany. Maybe Jane can comment on that.
Would we like to see a change in the law? Any comments, Rob?
Oh yes, definitely. And I think I might have been missed off the last round. And just to plug that, Brian's had his hand in the air for some time, but I'll be brief. Just to say, yeah, totally support using a hierarchy of vulnerability or the measures that Nicola mentioned. Just something like that to sort of give cyclists more safety and a greater priority on our roads is. Totally makes sense with the Wokingham. And to go back on your comments, Joe, or come back on your comments, Joe, about evaluating schemes, the Wokingham Road scheme is one that went in near to me, and again it was one that there was very little consultation. The transport planners didn't really seem to listen to the feedback people gave, and we ended up with, I don't know if anyone knows the entrance to Wokingham Road, to Alfred Sutton Primary School on Wokingham Road, but it is a very narrow pavement with railings that is now a shared use cycle lane. It's probably about a metre and a bit of pavement where, I don't know, 300 kids come out of school at the end of the school day, and it's a shared use cycle lane. It's just ridiculous. I can't see that any cyclist in their right mind would use it. And yeah, these schemes, I don't think they're being sort of developed particularly well. I don't think cyclists are being listened to, and I'm pretty sure that scheme hasn't been evaluated. And if it was, it would be seen, or large amounts of it would be seen as a total disaster. Back to you.
Brian, you've got your hand up.
I very much like the comment about Caversham Bridge vibrating with the heavy lorries. My father provided the traction engines that were put on Caversham Bridge to test it when it was built, but they were stationary. And I'm sure the lorries are heavier now. The point about road charging for low emission zones and workplace parking, it's not being done because the politicians are scared of the votes. Now, those Reading councillors should get together from all parties and say, we're going to implement it. And if they all supported it, then they wouldn't have to be scared of the motorist lobby. They ought to be scared of the cyclist lobby because of the danger. And we must remember that climate change is an important issue, and we've got to keep vehicles off the roads more and more as time goes by, and therefore the low emission zone charging, the workplace parking charges or prevention are going to be very, very important. A couple of other things. Pothole sizes. The council has a pothole size before they will repair it. Those pothole sizes should be reduced because they are there for the benefit, those sizes are for the benefit of motorists. They don't take the requirements of cyclists into account. Speed bumps, yeah, they're jolly good. They put in some new speed bumps, much needed in Allcroft Road and Morgan Road, but there's no little gap round the side for cyclists.
Brian.
Yeah, I know you know about it.
They are hateful, nasty speed bumps for a cyclist, I can assure you.
If they left a little gap down, gap down the side, if they thought of doing that, like they do with some of the smaller speed bumps, which are divided into two, then they'd be good for cyclists as well. Lack of thought, I'm afraid.
Right, Jane, can I come to you? Getting together with the other parties to press for, low emission zones. Would you be supporting it?
Well, I'd have to talk to my group first of all. I can't just make decisions on the fly, I'm afraid.
Of course not.
I mean, one of our issues is about air quality in Reading, and we know we've got some really poor air quality, Cemetery Junction, around the bottom of Caversham Bridge. We've got particular areas where we have a lot of standing traffic, and that causes poor air quality. The one good thing we have in Reading, and I have to declare an interest here that I'm a non-executive director of the bus company, is that Reading Buses has invested in low emission buses. So we've got some ultra clean diesels, and we've got the gas powered buses that not only it's a cleaner burn than a diesel, and it's also quieter. So it's good. It's good for two.
And we still exceed European limits on air pollution.
Yeah. So if we can, we need to get, as said, vehicles off the road, particularly the HGVs, particularly ones that are just going through Reading to get to the M4. If we can get rid of those, then that should help reduce congestion and help improve air quality. And that's where we want to go. And to have a modal shift, get people onto the buses, get people cycling, get people walking. People did it during the pandemic. I know there was a great concern before we had the first lockdown about whether or not people would listen and whether or not they'd have that behaviour change to stay at home and work. I run a charity, I have 20 staff, and we used to have 6 of us in the office 5 days a week, and we now don't have an office and we all work from home. I'd invested in laptops for everybody. We'd had Microsoft 365 installed on all the laptops beforehand. Everybody had broadband at home. I needed to buy one person a decent chair. Everybody else had decent chairs and desks. And, so we're not travelling anywhere unless we need to get together for a meeting. So last week I had my first office meeting for a year, just over a year. And I'm very proud to say I went by bus and everybody else came in by train.
Excellent. Rob, final words.
Thank you, Joe. Yeah, in response to Brian's suggestions on working across pipelines on demand management, yeah, totally support that. Although from having participated in discussions with councillors and council meetings, I'm not particularly hopeful with the workplace parking levy motion that we moved a number of years ago. I can't remember, the Lib Dems might have backed it, I can't remember, but I definitely remember that Labour and the Conservatives voted against the motion, and a measure which would have raised money, which is what people always complain about, and which would have reduced the number of cars on the roads, which is something that we would like to see to enable space for those healthy, sustainable alternatives. And I support, as Jane was talking about, people catching the bus, but if you talk to your doctor's going to say do something active, and many people are able to cycle, and doing something active is going to be far better for you than sitting on your bum for 30 minutes or so. Yeah, thank you.
Ricky, final words.
Well, we're more than happy to work with other parties, and I'm sure we have cooperated, certainly with the Greens in the past on various things. But I share Rob's thoughts about getting the rest of some of our administration Labour councillors onto the same ballpark.
Like Paul.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, particularly to answer Brian's point, I mean, I think road pricing would be something that national government has to do. I mean, local councils can take specific local measures. Obviously, in London, they've got congestion charging zones and obviously low emission zones. There are very few other councils actually across the country that have gone it alone with these type of schemes. And as I say, they do actually have to be viable as well as effective. So I think all party campaigns to campaign for demand management issues would be helpful. And I think actually you'd probably get a good degree of support right across political parties for that. And then, I mean, Rob mentioned the workplace levy. It is in the local transport plan. It's like everything, the timing of these, when you put them in and the details of the scheme and things that need to be worked on, it's all very well having a council motion. And it's the same with the thing about the
percentage. Well, having a plan that mentions all these things.
Well, they essentially, Ricky, become they become meaningless unless you've got the resources to implement them and the ability
That's
to,
the problem with the plan
do
itself,
them
isn't it?
as regards the timing. So, you know, and I'm sorry, Rob did mention, I mean, you know, this is the thing, isn't it? Rob mentioned continually mentioned the mass rapid transport scheme. I mean, that was a scheme that was entirely funded by the local enterprise partnership, not funded by the council. And look,
I think there was some community infrastructure levy money that was going to be spent on it, local money.
We still have a problem with east-west. We still have a problem with east to west journeys through the cemetery junction, and we've got to find a solution to it. We've come up with actually one in some of the active travel schemes that we've widely consulted on. So somebody said we don't consult on schemes. We did the biggest consultation exercise I think the council has ever done, certainly for a transport scheme, on the 5 active travel schemes. And the good news was we found that, you know, even the scheme through Cemetery Junction, which just involves taking a line of traffic out on the road from the Sutton Seeds roundabout to the Cemetery Junction, there was actually more support for that than against, which surprised me, and it was a pleasant surprise. So we are consulting on schemes. We are putting, you know, we've got 5 very good schemes for arterial transport, and we will continue through the local transport plan and also by lobbying government, hopefully with all party support, to get more funding to put in the sort of schemes that we all want to see. You know, there really is no lack of ambition from the council, but timing on this is crucial. And as Jay mentioned, we just don't, you know, people are all working from home now. We just don't know the shape of travel. And that will evolve over the next year or so. I think we'll be able to tell whether these patterns are continuous. And I think overall that will be, you know, it'll be a good thing that more people are working from home, taking, you know, and be able to and less commuting and making less of a carbon footprint actually.
Thank you very much to all of you, to Paul and Jane and Rob, Ricky. I'm going to wind it up now. It's we've left it for well over an hour, and so thank you a great deal. I'd like to assure our councillors that, you know, the Reading Cycle campaign, you know, this is our reason for being here, isn't it, Keith? And we'll be following all the developments of the local transport plan and these schemes, and we hope that we will become, you know, a gentle thorn in your side over the coming year, and we'll hope to see some of these plans come into fruition. So thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you, and good night.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Right.
Cheers.
Before we wind up the AGM, although it's not actually on the agenda, I will just run round. Is there any other competent business that this AGM should be transacting before we